Hey guys, so I just had a discussion with Stephen Morrison. He's an expert on a lot of modern theologians, some of whom I'd consider to be liberal theologians. And Stephen Morrison's definitely a lot more theologically liberal than I am. But I thought it would be good to talk to him because I've talked about a lot of these liberal theologians in my videos, but I haven't actually read much of them myself. So I thought I should talk to someone who's actually done their homework so I can better understand what these people are saying, so I can better address it. So without further ado, here is Stephen Morrison.
Today, I am joined by Stephen Morrison. He is a theologian, an author, and a seminary student, and I'm going to be asking him about some modern theology and some modern theologians. So, is it true that you wrote 14 books?
Yeah, I have written 14 books. That's kind of a ridiculous number to say. I think it depends on how you count it. Some of them are more pamphlets than books, but yeah. At my core, I feel like I'm called to being a writer, and I have, always loved writing. And so, yeah, I've written, just came out with the 14th last month.
Cool. So, just briefly introduce yourself for everyone who's new.
Sure. Yeah, Stephen Morrison's my name. I write under Stephen D. Morrison. I'm an author and theologian. As you said, I've written all these books from Columbus, Ohio. Grew up in kind of a traditional Methodist / charismatic church, and then kind of worked my way backwards into some more reformed theology, particularly through reading independently some theologians like Barth, but other big figures for me are like T.F. Torrance, Jürgen Moltmann, and more recently some of the liberation theologians like James Cone and Gutierrez. So, that's kind of a bit of me.
So, from what I've seen of your stuff, you seem to focus on the more like neo-Orthodox and liberal and liberation theologians. So my first question for you is, what is liberal theology? What is neo-Orthodoxy? Like, what's the difference and where do you think you would fall personally?
So, big, massive question, I guess.
I'm sorry, briefly explain this really complicated question.
Sure, yeah. So I guess I can start with the easy one. Neo-Orthodoxy is kind of a term that's fallen out of fashion. It was traditionally applied to people like in the post-Second World War period that were wrestling with the crisis of faith that kind of took place among specifically the German theologians. Barth was a main figure. He's not a German theologian. He's Swiss, but he was kind of the main figure that gets aligned to it. The other big three are Paul Tillich, Rudolf Bultmann, and Emil Brunner, typically with a few other names thrown in there. But a better term is probably crisis theology was the original term for it, or dialectical theology, which is the term I prefer. Neo-Orthodoxy is sometimes used as kind of a slanderous term towards these figures to say that they're outside of orthodoxy. And so if that's your opinion, well, whatever, but most scholarship doesn't use that anymore, even people that are critical of those figures. And then, the liberal theology and liberation theology are very different things. So important to distinguish those. Liberal theology is kind of such a broad term. I think it just tends to be, there's two different approaches to it. It's either a method term or it's a content term. In terms of content, it's things like, it tends to be certain doctrines that are either accepted or rejected that conservatives would, on the other side, dogmatically accept. But in terms of method is really the main difference. Liberal theologians typically are a little bit more conscious of the situation of modernity and are more trying to not react to it, but to come alongside it and work with modernity, whereas conservative theologians typically are reactionary theologians who are just reacting to modernity and either are kind of digging into dogmatism further or are trying to combat with modernity. But that's the broadest strokes. I mean, it's also a fluid term. If you're in Europe, it means one thing. If you're in Canada, it means something else. If you're in the United States, depending which state you're in, it means something totally different. So, that's the broadest, shortest I can be there. So,
and where would you fall? I know it's very complicated, but like there's, conservative theology, there's neo-Orthodoxy, there's liberal theology, there's liberation theology. Like, which, if any of those labels, would you apply to yourself, even if no label is perfect?
Right. Yeah. I mean, nobody likes labels. Sometimes they're helpful.
It's hard to say. Maybe I'll put it this way. On a scale from John MacArthur to the universalist pastor who doesn't believe in God, maybe 1 to 10, the universalist pastor is on the 10. Like, where would you put yourself? And maybe then answer the first question.
Uh, Gosh, I have no idea. On what question? On hell? I mean, see, all these things, there's different loci within theology that I would place myself on different sides of the spectrum. So I, affirm the bodily resurrection of Christ, which typically places you in more of the conservative camp. I typically affirm the virgin birth. Some days I don't, but that typically places me within a conservative camp. Then I deny inerrancy. So that typically places me in the liberal camp. I do believe in social justice and the necessity of that. So that sometimes places me in the liberal camp. So it really just depends on a number of different things. So yeah, that's not a clear answer, but that's, yeah, generally. I think if I'm referring to myself, I am trying to be a modern theologian. So somebody that does actually respond to modernity and to the changing situation that we're in today, particularly the social situations and how those correspond with each other. And so in that sense, I do have probably the closest affiliation with liberation theology, but through a Barthian lens. So through the work of Barth and others working into liberation theology. That's kind of where a lot of my work now fits. But at the end of the day, I think I'm a person that I'm just curious and I'm a scholar. I'm always asking research questions and wanting to learn more. And so I'm not trying to pin myself down to anything. Any of these things can change and have changed over time. And I think that's the beauty of theology, is the fact that we're finite, imperfect human beings. And actually, the way I think about it is that perfect theology is ahead of me in the eschaton, and I'm never going to get it until then. And so I'm just on a journey, and I'm a pilgrim on the way. And so that's my take on all of that.
All right. So there's conservative theology, there's liberal theology, but you're saying that liberation theology and neo-orthodoxy can't necessarily be put into those two camps?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's just they're too broad of terms to pin something down. I mean, they can be helpful for an encyclopedia blurb, but in terms of if you're really interested in theology, the only way to really answer these questions, they're complicated questions. Everybody's wrestling with really complicated questions. And so I think we do a disservice to theologians when we just put them in sort of labels.
Okay.
Because they're complicated thinkers and they're very nuanced thinkers. And I think, Kierkegaard, whether or not he actually said this, supposedly had said that, if you label me, you negate me. And so sometimes labels can be actually a way just to end the conversation. I think if they're a way to begin the conversation, that's great. So anyways, that's a long-winded discussion for a simple question, but
cool. So you focus on a lot of figures. To me, it seems like you've especially focused on Karl Barth. Karl Barth is like the kingpin. That's him up there on the Time magazine. Yeah. He's the kingpin of neo-orthodoxy. What I do know about him so far is that he's sort of like the quantum physics of Reformed theology. The thing everyone quotes to try and sound a lot smarter than they are. A lot of theology nerds like me will say, as Karl Barth, as if we've read any of him. I've not read any Karl Barth. I've only I've only listened to podcasts and YouTube videos about him. But you've read all the church dogmatics. I didn't know the universe contained enough time to do that, but apparently you have. So I do have a lot of questions about Karl Barth. But first, is it Barth or Bart? What's better?
Bart. The H is silent. Yeah.
Okay. I just feel like I'm talking about Bart Simpson. But anyway. So
yeah, Bart Simpson's fine. That's good. Yeah.
Brief overview. Just who is Karl Barth for those who have never heard of him?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. So Barth was a 20th century theologian, one of the more influential theologians of that period. He was a Swiss Reformed theologian. He was born to a Swiss pastor and professor. His father was a Swiss pastor and professor. And then he did go for his education to the kind of the top figures of liberal theology within Germany, figures like Wilhelm Hermann and Adolf Harnack. And then after his education, he went and became a pastor in Safenville in 1911. And it was in 1914 when the First World War started. His kind of turn away from liberal theology, his disillusionment with liberal theology, was seeing all of his old professors, especially people like Harnack, signed a manifesto, an academic manifesto to support the war. And so he recognized that there must be something wrong in their theology that led them to that conclusion. And so him with his friend Edward Thurneyson in Safenville, both of them were pastors, decided they needed to go back and do their theological ABCs. They needed to just read the Bible because they felt like they had nothing actually to say to their situation. And Barth was in a very rural industrial town. He became quite politically involved. He was a radical socialist at the time, was quite involved. He was in the SPD, which was the more radical left wing of the socialist parties at the time. That was Rosa Luxemburg's party, if I remember correctly. And anyway, so after that, that led him to the Epistle of the Romans, especially, and he wrote this now famous commentary on the Epistle of Romans, which challenged some of the things about liberal theology, and it dropped supposedly like a bombshell on the theological playground, is this famous line about it. And then, that on the strength of that, he became a professor in Germany at various different universities until he was dismissed by his refusal to take the Hitler oath before his classes. And so he was active and involved in the Confessing Church, which was the anti-Hitler movement where Bonhoeffer was involved. He was the principal author of the Barmen Declaration, which is
yes, my denomination actually has that as one of our official confessions. So that's
great. Yeah.
Basically how I know about Barth, because I have read the Barmen Declaration. So from what I can tell, it seemed like the liberal professors were just going with the flow of society because they didn't have that much of a substantial message for the church. And Barth was like, actually, we need a substantial message or else we're just going to do whatever the culture tells us. And sometimes the culture is Hitler. Is that accurate?
Partially. It more had to do with his doctrine of God. For all of the dialectical theologians of that time, the crisis theologians I talked about, one of the unifying themes of their work is the non-objectifiability of God. So this fact that God cannot become an objectified thing that we can grasp or we can control, or that we can say we have God. And so that was the recognition that they had that they saw in their liberal professors this error of projecting God from the human. Barth has this great phrase where he says, we cannot speak of God as if speaking of man in a loud voice. And so that whole projection and that whole kind of sense where we have this privileged grasp on God because we're people of faith is something that he worked to reject. And so that was, so it is partially a cultural thing, but it is a little bit more theologically based and politically based as well. It was a political decision. And so, that's big part of it. But it was a return just to the Bible, and having to have something to say to his congregation was a big part of it too. It's a pastoral concern.
Yeah. So you mentioned Barth was Swiss Reformed. He was part of the Swiss Reformed Church, which is historically a Calvinist church. It's part of the Calvinist tradition. I know Barth is self-consciously a part of the Calvinist tradition. So the question is, is Barth a Calvinist? And even if I know he disagreed with Calvin on a lot, but I'm a Calvinist. I subscribe to the Westminster Confession for the most part, including the doctrine of election. So could you be a classical Calvinist and adopt Barth's theology? Or is that not possible? Does Barth just basically bring something brand new and contradictory to the table?
No, it's certainly compatible. A lot of theologians have done that work after Barth. T.F. Torrance is an interesting example. He's a Scottish theologian that was a little bit closer to Calvin. He actually translated the commentaries into English. And so, it's certainly possible. I mean, Barth certainly lived within the Reformed tradition. He when he became a professor after the Epistles commentary or the Romans commentary, he was assigned to teach Reformed theology at a Lutheran university. And so he kind of learned Reformed theology trial by fire, basically. And so, he was very much steeped in that. He wrote an entire study on Calvin, which is actually very good. And so he was fascinated by Calvin, certainly. But he works within that tradition to some extent. It's scholarly debates go on all the time with this, but certainly there's room to see a point of comparison. They would disagree on many things, but I think the best way of looking at it is that Barth actually takes some of the central impulses that Calvin has, and he makes them, he improves upon them, and he builds upon them. And so there certainly can be some comparison here, or some compatibility.
Right. So I've always been, like a lot of people, I've been very fascinated with Barth, despite not really understanding Barth. So I've been trying to wonder, based on what I know, is it possible to reconcile Barth's doctrine of election with Calvin's/Augustine's doctrine of election, and say both at the same time? Like, what I've said is fundamentally, yes, election is in Christ. We are chosen in Christ. Election isn't just some individual, like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. But I think there's two dimensions to it. Like, first and foremost, election is in Christ. All who are united to Christ are elect. But I also would agree with Calvin and Augustine that there is, individual election. So is it possible to wholeheartedly affirm Barth's doctrine of election and Calvin's doctrine of election?
I mean, this is the biggest point of disagreement for sure. Barth's critique of Calvin is that he abstracts the individual situation and applies it to God. And so Barth is trying to be more Christocentric than Calvin was, and more theocentric, actually. And so I think you can't necessarily say that, like, you can't make Barth into a double predestinarian. He's not that. I mean, he does have that, but in a Christological sense. But I think there's a way to appreciate both and work together in that sense of agreement. So I don't think they're necessarily at odds with one another. I mean, Barth is still working, again, within some categories that Calvin had in mind, specifically the double predestination idea. But he applies that aspect to Christ more consistently, I think, and he does it in a way where the actual because to back up, the big idea for Barth's theology is that who God is and what it means for God to be divine is only something we can know through God's actual acts towards us in Jesus Christ. And so that cuts off this point of abstracting from human experience something up into God. And so how do we know the God who elects? We can only know it through the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, which to in Scripture. And so the God and human aspect, the Chalcedonian definition, is really the core of what he's doing. He goes, the whole doctrine of election for Barth really is this reframing of it, and it makes it a little bit more Christ-centered, where the actual we are elected only in Christ, and we are rejected as well, all of us actually in Christ, but he takes our rejection. So he ties it with soteriology, where we are, Christ takes the rejection for us, but we are elected in him. So God says yes to us is his basic message, and that God determined from all eternity to be our God, to be God not alone, but to be God for us and with us. And that election is the incarnation, and then that leads to the atonement. And so he's connecting the incarnation and the election together, and of course atonement together to that. But yeah, it certainly can work. I mean, I think there's an interesting study, I don't remember the author right now, but that makes the argument that actually Barth is closer to Calvin than he thinks he is, and that kind of rereads Calvin behind the back of some of the post-Reformation dogmatics that kind of systematized Calvin into like tulip and all these other things. Because the original Calvin is actually quite interesting in some of these questions. He's not so dogmatic. And I think returning to more of the nuance of Calvin can actually help this conversation a lot. Because I think if you're rigidly stuck in only tulip, there's so much more richness to Calvinism than just tulip. I mean, it's a beautiful and rich thing, and I think Barth's very much a part of it and has a lot to contribute. For sure.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that last thing you said, that there's way more to Calvinism than tulip. Like, I've read Calvin, I read the Institute's read his treatise on the sacraments. It's completely different from what you'll find in your average, like, Reformed Baptist, or even some Presbyterians. I'm not completely letting Presbyterians off the hook here. Because, Calvin says we're never supposed to speculate on whether we're elect. So that means even if we really have faith, we can't speculate on whether we're elect. And contrast that with, like, a lot of, conservative Calvinists today who are, like, worried they're not elect anymore because they watched something they shouldn't yesterday or something. I don't know. And it's like this idea of like, oh, we can only view election through Christ. That sounds kind of Barthian, but you see that in Calvin, you see that in John Knox, you even see that in John Owen, one of the Puritans, I think. So I see Barth as often like rediscovering a lot of what the Calvinist tradition had sort of wandered away from. Another thing I'm really curious about with Barth is he identified not only as a Calvinist, but as a supralapsarian. And supralapsarian is the more spicy form of Calvinism that's even more hardcore on its double predestination than Calvin was. Like, that's the, and for those of you who don't know, supralapsarian says that God actively created some just for the purpose of damning them, that the fall was caused by God in order to justify saving some and damning others. That's superlapsarianism. So in what sense is Barth a superlapsarian if he's trying to move away from that whole double predestination thing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a sticking point of a lot of big debates in the Barth scholarship. So it's uh, super complex. But I think in short, the way that he works through this is a little bit more where he begins the idea that the doctrine of election is actually a statement, first of all, about God. And so it is a statement that God elects God's self to be our God. And so before election takes place in time, there is this event in God's very life where God chooses not to be God without the human race. And so this idea that we sometimes have that God was just twiddling his thumbs and someday decided, I'll just make the world. That is kind of cut off. Where from the very beginning, God decided that God would be the God of creation. And that necessitated a fall because of finitude, because of the nature of existence, because of the nature of estrangement, and all these things. And so, yeah, that's a part of it. I mean, that's a reading that is a little bit maybe controversial as well. So there's a lot of nuance here. But yeah, and there has been recent research that suggests that he's not a superlapsarian, that he's the infolapsarian, whatever the contrarian one. That reads him in that way. And I think there's some case to that argument as well. And so, yeah, it's something I'm not an expert in necessarily, but I do think that there's, he understood himself as working within that tradition, but he does it in a very unique way. He does that with everything. He always takes something and does it in his own way. He's quite a creative thinker in that regard.
Yeah, for me, it seems like he's just sort of try to rethink Calvinism. He's just like, I think what Calvin was trying to say is this. I guess the way I would explain it is he's a superlapsarian in that he sees that election is logically before everything else. But he just wouldn't say that election refers to individuals. It refers to Christ. Would that be accurate?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm really fascinated with a lot of these modern guys like Barth, Jürgen Moltmann, and T.F. Torrance, and like maybe some of the other guys. But the thing is, I'm also, I guess you would call me conservative because I'm very concerned with maintaining orthodoxy. A big part of like what I talk about is trying to get the mainline church to return to orthodoxy, which it has for the most part abandoned. So all of these guys are really fascinating, but I'm concerned that sometimes neo-Orthodox theologians to some extent, and I think the liberation theologians to a greater extent, don't seem to often sometimes disregard orthodoxy in favor of what they're trying to say, especially when it comes to doctrine of God. Because the biggest thing I would disagree with Barth on is his rejection of natural theology, his rejection of classical philosophy. I would much favor the approach of someone like Jordan Cooper, who says that, like, if you reject the classical philosophy the church has used to talk about God, then what you're going to do instead is just use whatever the philosophy of your current day and age is. That's why, like, during the during the Romantic era, they would be very romantic about our experience of God. And now in the postmodern, or like now in the social justice era, the God in the mainline churches is often talked about in like social justice terms. So a lot of people in the more conservative denominations, like the PCA or the OPC, just say, oh, stay away from that toxic liberal theology. And my approach as someone who's mainline, but also tries to be orthodox, is what can we learn from these theologians? But I find it kind of hard to, even if they say something really good, like Jürgen Moltmann's thing about the transformation of the whole world, I could not agree with that more strongly. I would say he's not the only one to say that, but do you agree with the assertion that a lot of these neo-Orthodox and liberation theologians sometimes disregard orthodoxy, especially regarding the doctrine of God?
I mean, it depends on how you define orthodoxy, ultimately. The way I see it, this is actually an area where Barth and some of the dialectical theologians are quite helpful, because they recognize that orthodoxy is a living thing. It's not a stagnant thing. And so Moltmann and I actually think is quite interesting here, where you could take his eschatology, his theology of hope, one of his great works, and apply that to this question. And I think if orthodoxy is something behind us in finite history, I think that's a problem. I think orthodoxy is ahead of us. It's an eschatological reality. It's something that we're heading to. And so if by orthodoxy you just mean repeating something in the past, I mean, I think we stand on the foundation of the past, of course, and we respect and we live within that. But I don't think it's a narrow space. I think it's a broad space. I think the way I think about proper orthodoxy should be kind of like the guardrails on a bowling alley. You know, you're not going to fall into the gutter if you just have the guardrails up. And Friedrich Schleiermacher actually has a good way of putting it, where he says the two natural heresies that theology tends to err into is either the docetic or the Nazarean, which is either the emphasis on the divine or the emphasis on the human. And he said, as long as we're within this category, where in a Christological sense, of course, where we uphold the full divinity and humanity, but then in the larger theological sense, where we're upholding the Christian message and the situation, where we're upholding, the truths of God, but then the reality of our context, all of these things where we're living within that. I think that's a helpful understanding for orthodoxy. And so, yeah, in that sense, I think all of these people are living within this living faith. And I think that's one of the critiques of somewhat of a more conservative theology, is this idea of you take finite speech about God and it becomes an object, and it becomes really an idol. Because anytime you take something that's finite, that's limited by a finite reality and under the conditions of finitude, and you give it an ultimate status, an eternal status, that's idolatry. That's the definition of idolatry. And so I think we always have to realize that our best speech of God is always a failure. The absolute smartest theologians in the world are always failures ultimately when they speak of God. And Barth talks about that, where he says that we cannot speak of God, but we are obligated to speak of God because God has spoken of God's self in Jesus Christ. And so we're torn between the obligation and the impossibility, and all we have to do is to give thanks. And so in that sense, his solution to some of these problems is just to be thankful. We have this great duty to try to speak of God. We know that we live within a humility. And so, I mean, that's a bit of a soapbox to answer your question, but in terms of how I think about orthodoxy, I think that's relevant for some of this, because it really depends on how you define orthodoxy. And so maybe you can specify a little bit more what you mean. What's the concern with doctrine of God orthodoxy that you particularly have in mind?
Yeah. So I would agree with you that seeing orthodoxy as just a thing in the past is problematic. In the past, I've criticized denominations like the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the PCA for only using the Westminster Confession, as if these 1600s Puritans got it absolutely right and no one's ever going to get it absolutely right again. So we're just basically frozen in time. I do like that my denomination, the PCUSA, and ECO, which I'm also sort of part of, has confessions from all throughout history, from the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. We do use Westminster. I do agree with Westminster. But there's also documents that are actually from the Reformation, and there's a few documents that address modernity, like the Confession of 1967 and the Barmen Declaration. So I would agree that, orthodoxy is not just in the past. Orthodoxy is in the past, present, and future. But I would see the development of orthodoxy as more of clarification over time. And the clarification happens usually when a heresy is introduced. I know I made fun of people who did this earlier, but it's sort of like quantum physics, where certain two things exist simultaneously until you observe, and then it collapses to one or the other. So usually in the church, there's a bunch of views on a topic existing simultaneously until a debate breaks out, and then it collapses to one or the other. So was the church, I don't know, did the church of the apostles confess the doctrines of the Nicene Creed? Well, it's hard to say. A fundamentalist would say yes. A liberal would say no. The truth is, I think that it was just kind of fuzzy back then, and it didn't come into full focus until the Nicene Creed, when they clarified that the Father is God and the Son is God. But they still didn't explicitly clarify that the Holy Spirit is God, so they needed to do that at the Council of Constantinople. And they still didn't clearly define what it meant that Jesus was truly God and truly man, so they clarified that at the Council of Chalcedon. I'm sorry for any of my Miaphysite watchers here. So then they clarified what the doctrine is about God, but then 1,000 years later, in the Western Church, there's okay, how does salvation work exactly? And then that had to be clarified, and then it's splintered into a million pieces. But I see it as more coming into focus. So I'm sure that none of our confessions explicitly say that God is not a tomato. But if there's a new group of people that insists God is a tomato, then there will be a new confession to explicitly deny that. So I see orthodoxy over time as just coming into more and more focus. But
so what's the specific? I mean, I'm just curious. What's the specific? You mentioned liberation theology, and I mean, they're separate things, right? But neo-orthodoxy, again, I like dialectical theology better. What's the specific? Because you mentioned doctrine of God. What's the specific claim you think they're making that is outside of that orthodoxy?
A lot of the liberal and liberation theology I see, especially within the mainline, doesn't seem to see God as actually existing. This is in the most radical forms. But I think the more moderate forms can still sometimes lead to that, because if you say, oh, we can't really speak about God, what's to stop someone from saying God is just a metaphor for social justice? Because especially in like the United Church of Christ, the more progressive wing of the PCUSA, I've talked to a lot of pastors who say like, we can't really know if God exists. God probably doesn't exist, but the idea of God is a good inspiration to do social justice. So it's basically, on the more radical end, it's basically atheism. On the more moderate end, it's not necessarily atheism, but it's a sort of wishy-washy uncertainty that opens the door wide open for atheism. So there are a lot of liberation theologians who explicitly contradict things like divine immutability and stuff like that, or that God is all powerful. That's pretty essential. That's like
probably process theology does that, not as much liberation theology. But yeah, I know what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I can't name like 10 top liberation theologians off the bat, but there's like in the mainline, denial of those things runs rampant. And in those liberation theology circles, the priority is just on social justice, and it's a shift away from orthodoxy. So that's kind of why I ended up rejecting a lot of the progressive theology, because I used to be very progressive. I used to be very left-wing progressive, all that. And at first I tried to make Christianity compatible with it. But what I noticed is a trend that, I would say you're kind of an exception, but a trend I noticed is most people who were like LGBTQ affirming and very pro-social justice tended to not really care about having an orthodox doctrine of God or of salvation, but especially of God. That's the more important thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would think what I understand is that that's either a mischaracterization of certain people's ideas or just talking to the wrong people, because I don't run into that at all. I think the liberation theologians have recaptured something very essential that mainline churches have missed about the Bible and about who God is. I mean, for the Hebrew people, the one of the first declarations of who God is that God is their liberator from oppression, from the Exodus. I mean, that was a real event. This is, something that the definition of God repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. He says, I'm the one who liberated you from Egypt. Therefore, I'm your God and you serve me. This was an event of liberation. And so they're rediscovering something that is essential actually to the biblical witness about God. And I don't think, there may be some outliers that do what you say, that collapse God into that event. But I think the majority, because I've studied liberation theology pretty extensively. I mean, my new book talks about liberation theology some. It kind of works within that vein. But I couldn't name any off my head that would say that they actually collapse God. That's either probably a misreading from some conservatives that aren't necessarily asking the same questions or aren't understanding their context as well, or who knows. I mean, there's probably one or two outliers that God's some mystical spiritual force that just helps me get up in the morning or whatever. I mean, that's fine. Yeah, that's critique that. That's totally fine. But I think a lot of this is just a mischaracterization of these guys. And, I'd encourage you to read the people. Gustavo Gutierrez is great. James Cone in the American context is great. There's a lot of more systematic even theologians that do some really good work in that world. So, I found that, unless there's something more concrete, you mentioned immutability. To some extent, Bart doesn't affirm immutability. Well, he probably affirms immutability, but probably not. The late Bart probably doesn't, but the early does, I guess. That's one of the nuances with him. But like someone like Jürgen Moltmann is explicitly critiquing impassibility and with his crucified God. And so this is a trend that I think has important theological roots. And so if that's more what you're talking about, there's good reasons why they're making those arguments. And I don't think it's just because I think you can make the argument that impassibility misuses Platonic thought and applies it to Christian faith in a way that's not appropriate. That's a valid argument. It's not necessarily outside of orthodoxy to do that. I mean, it's outside of the Westminster Confession, but like you said, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, so those are two separate things, I guess. But that's kind of how I was responded as that. I'm not sure exactly where some of that's coming from, but I'd say the majority of the theologians that I'm aware of, the ones that I've written on, don't fall within that category, and certainly can fit within any sort of Orthodox confession. And I think one of the ways to think about this, I think, is really between spirit or letter. Do we follow the letter of Nicaea or the letter of these things, or are we more interested in what was the context of Athanasius and the fathers in defeating Arius? What was the context of the Chalcedonian formula, and what were they trying to do? And how can that then inform how we do that same work today? And that doesn't mean necessarily repeating the exact letter of what they said, but the spirit of what they said should be retained. And so in that sense, I think we need to sit within that trajectory, but not in a legalistic sense where we just repeat certain doctrines just because, and that's the task of theology. That's the joy of theology, is it gives you this ability to wrestle with biblical truth, to wrestle with history, and to really try and apply the Christian message to our present situation in a way that's helpful for people, in a way that's relevant. And so I think there is some pragmatism to the errors that you talked about. I mean, I would say, yeah, God does exist. Of course, so yeah, I don't know if that's resonating at all or what, but I think a lot of the statements that you made are a little bit, I don't mean to offend you, but a little bit from ignorance. I think that they're not accurate for the majority of these theologians.
You're right that I am ignorant of what liberation theologians have actually wrote. I have not read any of them. What I have read is just what I've observed in my own denomination.
Right. And so there's always that disconnect between the academy and the church. It's a massive chasm. So I live more over here. Excuse me. I live more over here in the academy. So I think that the pragmatic questions within the church, I think those are good questions to have for sure. But in terms of that, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
So the academic theologians in the church and in the seminaries, or the liberation theologians that you just mentioned, would the majority of them affirm that Jesus is truly God and that he physically, literally, bodily rose from the dead? The majority of them?
I mean, the bodily resurrection is probably the one that is a question mark. It depends on who you're talking about. But I would say the majority, yeah, Jesus was fully God. I also think they're doing different things in terms of, again, spirit or letter, whether or not, we can affirm, just have to repeat this letter without thinking about it, or whether or not we can ask some questions of what does it actually mean for the divine nature and the human nature to coexist. And is it appropriate to talk about divine and human nature as if nature is the same thing, when they're totally different? Divine nature is quantitatively different than human nature. So how do we talk about this in a more constructive way for our time, especially post-Enlightenment, to work through some of these issues? And so, yeah, I mean, it's not a yes or no question, but I would say, the ones I've read, I think the emphasis on a lot of these questions are a little bit more for their context. Liberation theologians, for example, are interested in the resurrection as a bodily resurrection, more in the sense of Christ being raised by the oppressed, coming out of their oppression and finding liberation in that sense. And so James Cone talks about this idea of that, we deny the resurrection whenever we do not help the least of these, whenever we see those who are oppressed and we don't do anything to help them. So but it doesn't mean that he denies the bodily resurrection of Christ. I actually think he does affirm the bodily resurrection of Christ. but it's just not the emphasis for him. So I think they're presupposing a lot of these traditional questions, but for them, they're trying to apply it to a context and a situation that isn't really our own. I mean, we're from the first world. We're in relatively privileged position as being in the first world. And they're looking at the slums where their neighbors are getting killed and their family are getting killed. And they're trying to ask the question of, what does God mean for me and for my people? And so that's where I get skeptical of any sort of like these conservative guys, like some of the people you've mentioned I've heard of before, and that are critiquing liberation theology, but they're sitting here in the first world. They have a different context. They're asking just different questions, and they don't understand enough the context of somebody who doesn't have food in their mouth. And Jürgen Moltmann has this great quote where he says, reading the Bible as somebody that has a full belly is completely different than reading the Bible as somebody who's hungry. And we have to recognize that. And so that's a bad misquote of exactly what he says, but basically to that effect, that we have to recognize the context and how the Christian message can actually be incarnate in our real context. And I think that's really the part of it is liberation theology is doing incarnational theology of trying to actually see Christ in our midst. And how does Jesus matter to the mother who just lost their child to gang violence? Or to the child that doesn't have any food, or for the 2 billion people that are food insecure around the world right now, or the million that will die for not having enough to eat right now. What does the message say to them? Their orthodoxy, I don't think it's always the most important question. I think the important question is, what are we doing as the people of Christ to liberate them from that oppression? And so that's the context and the question that they're looking at. Orthodoxy matters to them, I think. A lot of them are very steeped. I mean, Gutierrez, it was Miranda. Jose Miranda studied, classical Greek philosophy. He did his whole dissertation. He's a PhD. A lot of these guys are brilliant theologians that have this basis, but similar to Barth, they're going to their context and saying, how does this actually matter to these people? I don't know if that answers the question, but I think the orthodoxy thing is there. I think some of them presuppose it more than necessarily making it the explicit center of their work. But it's certainly there for sure.
Yeah. Now, I think all Christians would agree that trying to analyze what does Christ mean for those in the worst of circumstances is extremely beneficial. I don't know anyone who would say, no, you should only look at Christ through the eyes of, affluent Westerners in the first world. I don't know anyone who would say that. The problem that I think a lot of people have with liberation theology specifically is it tends to, you hear all these categories, there's feminist theology, Black theology, Asian theology, Native American theology. And it's at first when I hear that, I'm like, okay, are these denominations, how there's Presbyterian theology, Lutheran theology? But then I realized, theology, what does that really mean? It's just it's God talk. That's what I heard on a PCUSA podcast. Theology is God talk. So it seems to make theology less about actually what do we know about God and just an analysis of how different people talk about God. So then the question of theology seems less about actually answering the questions about God and more asking the question, how does the idea of God help people cope with oppression? Sure. That's why the virgin birth is so important for the theologians who the liberals would call the fundamentalists. It's the Bible doesn't say you need to believe in the virgin birth to be saved. What it is, it's a litmus test to see if someone's willing to affirm that there is actually a supernatural reality. Because I don't think I've heard of anyone who would deny the virgin birth but truly affirm the bodily resurrection. Usually when people deny the virgin birth, they say, oh, the resurrection is a metaphor for the new life that we have when we see this metaphor of Jesus or something, or that God is just analyzed through how people talk about God, just purely subjective. I know that that's not what they all say, but that's how it can come across. And I think that is what some of them are saying, that we're not actually trying to analyze God. I shouldn't say analyze God. We're not actually trying to know God as something that actually exists, but just trying to ask how the idea of God can help us.
Right. No, for sure. That's certainly a danger. Don't want to say that it isn't. But I think the whole different labels, the Black theology, Latin American liberation theology, all these different labels that have come up have really just come up from a need to honestly reflect on our context and the fact that human beings do theology. God doesn't do theology. I mean, God is God. We do theology. And so it's kind of this humble realization of we are finite creatures limited by our conditions, by our context, and by our situation, and by our group, by our community. We have a certain community that we live and move within that is different from others. And so it's not that God no longer is being talked about or whatever, that we're collapsing it to just a whatever I think about God matters. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because I think there's a realization here that, you're doing white theology. You're doing male theology. You just don't necessarily think about it consciously that that's what you're doing, but that's what you're doing. And for the history of Christian thought, that wasn't explicit, that the fact that Karl Barth was writing in Switzerland, that he lived in Germany, that he was a Swiss theologian that had that particular context in mind when he was writing. He was a white European theologian. But what we've done is we've taken people like Barth, or really anybody, Calvin or anybody, and we think that we can extract them from their history and their culture and their context, and we think we can just universalize them. And again, that's a tendency towards idolatry, where we take a finite thing or a finite idea and think that it's universal or it's ultimate for all time and all places. And so that's the idea behind this label. And then the other side of the idea is the need to develop a theology from within that community, because the realization is that the scriptures were written within an oppressed community. I mean, it was written people that were occupied by Rome, or people that were in exile. Half of the Old Testament was written while they were in exile in Babylon or in different captivities. They were written very specifically for people that were hopeless and needed that hope, and they needed the realism of God is still with you. God is still faithful. I mean, you see that throughout the Psalms and everything. And so that kind of approach then translates to some of these theologians, like Black theologians, but asking questions of what does, my theology have to do with the fact that I'm discriminated because I'm Black, and that I suffer these tremendous oppressive systemic forces in my life, and I always will, because of white supremacy. What does theology say? If it has nothing to say to that context, then what's theology good for? I mean, in terms of like the real politique of it, right? The real pragmatism of it, like for daily lives. And so that's the one side of it. And like I said, the other side of arising from that community, the need to not have some white guy that's oppressing me and hates me because of the color of my skin tell me what my theology should be. I need to develop a theology for my own context and community and stand on my own feet. And that's part of what that is as well. And so I think, there's that realism. I don't think these labels I think you can go maybe too far where you're itemizing everybody. We're still Christian faith. We're still, within that, the one holy church. And so, that's kind of the responsibility. I don't know if that is helpful, if that clarifies some of that for you, but that's some of those labels. And, and you talk about the resurrection before. I mean, for me, I'll just say, if we find the bones of Jesus, my faith's in trouble. Like I affirm the bodily resurrection. I would say actually more liberation theologians do, because the bodily resurrection means hope for their bodies. And it can't just be some spiritual thing. It means hope for their bodies. For people that are oppressed bodily, it means hope for that. And actually, liberation theologians have critiqued liberal theology for that very thing. And so that's why I think they should never be the same, because they're very different. Liberation theology would look at a liberal theology that just says, the bodily resurrection is a metaphor, or it's some sort of spiritual sign that happened. And they would say, no, because that doesn't give my body any hope. It doesn't give any hope for people that are crucified by the empire like Jesus was. It doesn't give me any eschaton. And so, all of these things are connected, but that's another rant, I apologize. But that's kind of what I think for some of that. So I don't know if that's clarifying.
Thanks. I'm trying to understand like an argument for using the labels, white theology, Black theology, or whatever, and arguments against it. So I guess the arguments for it is just to be more honest and saying theology isn't God. Theology is people talking about God. So that, and, Calvinism is indeed all about avoiding idolatry. And I do believe it's possible to, idolize our theology. So I guess it'd be honest for me to say I'm doing, white, ethnically Jewish, New Yorkian Zoomer theology, I guess.
It's more just about being honest and upfront about your context and where you're coming from, because that's the
right.
problem.
And it's like we already say.
we treated theology as if it drops from heaven and just manifests on this earth. But no, people write theology. Yeah.
Now the danger, and I really think this is a danger, if we say this is white theology, this is black theology, that combined with a lot of the social justice mindset has that, you know, the whites are the oppressors and the blacks are the oppressed, and liberation theology is about siding with the oppressed. What I have seen, and in the main line, is a lot of orthodoxy being rejected because it's labeled as white theology. It's like, oh, the Westminster Confession, a lot of those guys might have been pro-slavery. That's white theology. Athanasius was a homophobe. And yeah, Athanasius was what people would call a homophobe. Should we reject the doctrine of the Trinity because you know, we shouldn't do
of course,
straight theology over gay? Like, nobody wants to say, you know, I really like white theology. That's my favorite kind of theology. I like it better than all the black theology. No one's going to want to say that in this day and age. So if you combine, like, it's like, I feel like if we say, oh, this is German theology, this is French theology, there's not so much fire attached to those labels. But if you're saying this is white theology, this is black theology, and you're also saying one group is oppressed, do you think I have seen that results in the rejection of a lot of orthodoxy because it's white male straight theology?
Yeah, so absolutely. No, it's an important question because it's important to clarify that some of these labels, the other aspect of it is rooted in a social analysis. And so traditionally, you know, theology's had its conversation partner primarily be philosophy. The liberation theologies take that and think that theology should have a conversation with sociology or with some of the more humanities other than just philosophy. And so it really is rooted in a social analysis. It's not just, I feel that somebody is mean to me and so I'm oppressed. It's not that. It's really rooted in the realities of concrete conditions, material conditions, and a social analysis of the fact that there are people who hold the power and are incentivized to keep things the way that they are because it benefits them, and that there are people who do not have power, they're disempowered, and they are oppressed by the way things are, the system and the status quo, and that those are the oppressed. And where's the church need to stand? Historically, it stood on the side of the people that have the power. And so liberation theology is saying, no, we need to stand on the side of those who do not have the power. We need to stand on the side. So you think the church,
for the most part, has not been on the side of the oppressed throughout history?
Yes and no. I mean, this is, I think, a important point about faith in general. Faith always has both elements included in it. There's always there's always the Luther and the Monzer, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the Peasants' War. There's the Luther that sided with the lords, and there was the Monzer, the Thomas Monzer, who led the peasants' revolt to on the other side. So there's always the revolutionary side and the reactionary side, and so both of these are present in churches all throughout, I mean, the world. And so there's always both dimensions. So yes and no. There are periods where it was oppressed, but then there are parts in the Constantinian area where it's been the oppressor. I mean, the Crusades are a good example. The witch burnings. I mean, there's so many examples for both. So it's both but it's contextual. So yeah, that's what I mean in terms of historically, a lot of times church as an institution, not necessarily church as people, I would say, yes, it's been more on the side of the oppressor.
So you mentioned like the revolutionaries versus the reactionaries. Are the revolutionaries always the good guys according to liberation theology?
I mean, it's not a unilateral yes or no statement. It depends on context and analysis. And so that's the whole thing. We're analyzing the reality and we're trying to actually look at the data and look at the systems of power and the struggles of power. So that's the whole sociological element to it, where they're analyzing systems of power and systems of injustice. Mm.
So a group of people that I think are marginalized, are oppressed, that I never see the social justice crowd talking about is young men. Mm-hmm. Have the highest suicide rates. Most of them are extremely lonely and cannot find friends, cannot find a partner. And I've met a ton of these people, and their only access to the divine is through Instagram. And sometimes they do have a lot of unsavory opinions, but I think that's because they've been forced into just the ghettos, like the intellectual ghettos online. Mm-hmm. So, and they do have a lot of thoughts about God. You see the trad movement. Well, there's a lot I don't like about the trad movement. And Jordan Cooper, one of my favorite theologians, has a good video critiquing the trad movement. But and you've made a video on like Jordan Peterson. it gets at a lot of real hurt that a lot of young men are experiencing. Do you think young Gen Z male theology is a discipline the church should study?
Yeah, maybe you'll be the one to write it. Why not? I mean, if there's a genuine need for that, which I think I agree with you, there certainly is. I mean, that's why I took Peterson to task, because I think he's filling the void that the church is certainly failing to address. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, my one of my professors at seminary was just talking about that there seems to be this need where it used to be, where typically men are being disenfranchised by the mainline churches. They're not attending church, they're struggling with all these things, but then they're still seeking. Nobody can avoid that need to seek the infinite. Even the most dogmatic atheist still has something that they consider ultimate. And so, yeah, it comes out in different expressions. But yeah, I would say, of course, I mean, I think there should always be that tension, though, because there is always the reality that historically white men have been privileged. That's the historical fact of things. I mean, there are contrary opinions of that. I understand war and family and all that, but in terms of that should maybe contest. But a theology of Zoomers, as you call yourself, could be interesting, could be constructive, and it could be helpful for people. It's your context, and I think that's the whole point of liberation theology. That's helpful for me is what's liberative for you about the Christian message that you can then constructively help other people that are like you. That's, I think, what's beautiful about liberation theology. And so, absolutely, yeah, maybe you'll be the one to write it. I'd read your book.
Now, I do think that it's important to see how the gospel impacts people of all different sorts. Mm-hmm. But there still is only one gospel. That's what the book of Galatians says. There's one gospel, and the gospel is medicine to all the groups. I don't think there's like a black gospel, a white gospel, and a woman's gospel or a queer gospel, because if I actually started doing like white male Gen Z theology and actually starting to say, hey, maybe what these people believe about God, let's turn this into doctrine, then God would end up being some alt-right meme who wants everyone to be based. Like, of course, you have compassion on all groups, but I feel like if we split the theology into these different groups, then we're splitting the gospel. We're acting like there's multiple gospel messages. There is one gospel message. Different people will focus on different aspects of the gospel. And I think what a lot of these modern theologians do is they're recovering an important neglected aspect of the gospel, that the gospel is not just about how you go to heaven. It's about the transformation of society. Right. I would put a much more conservative spin on the transformation of society than a lot of these people would. But I agree with that. It's a good thing. But I think at the end of the day, there needs to be unity, and there's one gospel message. And the gospel is for the oppressors and the oppressed, for the tax collectors and the sinners.
Right. No, I mean, you're right. It's one gospel, but I think it's received in different ways. And I think that's the distinction. It is one gospel. It's Jesus Christ as our Lord. But it's received in different ways. And I think the best example for that really is in the scripture in Luke 4, and really all of Luke's a great example for that, right? Like Jesus has in Luke 6, blessed are the poor, but woe to you who are rich. So that's one gospel, but it's received by two different socioeconomic situations. It's received differently. You trace that further back to Luke 4. I've come to proclaim liberty to the captives, etc. Right, and then even Mary's Magnificat, which is the rich will go away empty, is how it concludes. That the hungry or the downtrodden will be uplifted, and those who are up high will be brought down low. And so it's true that there is one gospel. It's still one Jesus, but the reception of Christ in different contexts is different. And so yes and no. There is the reality that the gospel does not. I mean, Paul talks about that a little bit in 2 Corinthians. I mean, it's maybe stretching his metaphor, but he has the sense of where the same thing can be a sweet smell to those who are being redeemed, but it can be a toxic odor to those who are not. And so it's the same thing, but it's received differently. And so I do think there's a dimension of recognizing that, where the message that for Christ was a message that is good news for the poor, it was bad news for the rich. It's the same message, but for the rich, and this is the aspect of liberation that gets misunderstood too. Liberating the oppressed does liberate the oppressor as well. It's not that you just say, screw the oppressor, we don't need to concern us about them. The oppressor is oppressed by their actual act of oppression. You dehumanize yourself when you attack somebody else. And so if I'm the oppressor, I need liberation from my own sinful will to power. That's a Nietzsche phrase, but it's still a good phrase. That I have put myself in this position where I exist and I have all these privileges because I oppress somebody else. That's actually dehumanizing me. I'm dehumanized because of that. I'm less, fully who I should be. I should be a loving person, whatever else. And so the liberation of the oppressed is how you actually liberate the oppressor as well. And so it's not just that you are only focused on one person. It's just that we recognize, in terms of liberation theologians, recognize that there's different socioeconomic realities or spiritual realities or any of these things where people need to be liberated in different ways. Not everybody's in the same place. And so, yes, one gospel message, but it is received differently. And that's all throughout Scripture. I mean, that's definitely reality. I mean, Calvinists, that's double predestination to some extent, that the same message is received in different ways by an elect and a reprobate. And so, there is this reality of both the oppressed and the oppressor should and do need to be liberated. But how that comes about is by focusing on the oppressed, because only by liberating the oppressed can the oppressor also be liberated.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So thank you for coming on. But first, do you have any questions for me?
When are you going to write that book? That sounds like a great book. Your Zoomer theology. I don't know. I just, want to say thank you, I guess. I mean, I don't have any burning questions. I think you're interesting person. I appreciate what you're trying to do with your page and your work. I disagree with you on a number of things, but I think people like us should have more conversations, because I think that's the beauty of the church. So I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, I'm a lot less liberal than you, but I've talked about a lot of these topics in my video without actually having someone to represent them properly. So that's sort of why I want all my followers to get to know you, to get someone who's actually studied these theologians and agrees with them on various things. So thanks for coming on. And thank you all for watching. I will see you guys later. Bye.